So my research, my passion is around diversity in higher education. But I was part of a workshop a couple of weeks ago, and somebody said, so as a college student, that's my field, right, higher education, where was your first encounter with diversity? What is a very memorable kind of first encounter in higher education? And I thought back to it, and I was part of what was a first-year seminar. It was called Christian Perspectives on Learning. And it was funny to me because I always talk about, when I was an RA on a diverse hall, and which was a major impact for me. But when I actually was prompted to think about what was your first encounter and how was it formative, it was my first year seminar. And it was facilitated by an instructor who was masterful. Masterful not because he was an expert, he was a theology prof, but because he was able to identify various identities in the room and say, hey, how do we make meaning about this topic in a way that invites everybody to the table, that doesn't just privilege my own or your own way of understanding, but that really seeks to invite people into this learning process, to be others-focused and intentional about that. And so it was fun for me to think back on that because I hadn't connected that. And so as I was thinking about this today, I thought, this is not just something we want to be an entree course, but it really is. It really is for students, oftentimes the first time in their collegiate experience that they're going to sit in a room with people who think differently than them and be encouraged and expected to take on others' perspectives. So when we think about this today, we're going to take a couple of different approaches. So much like Karen and Rebecca talked about this morning, there are a lot of components to inclusive pedagogy. And you may be thinking again, well, that the curriculum, my curriculum isn't necessarily a diversity curriculum. I want to make clear, diversity is always in the room. Diversity is a part of every classroom situation. And if we can't, much like at APU, we say, well, faith integration, it's central to who we are. It doesn't matter what your content is. It's always in the room. That's how we view diversity. And so what we're going to do today is try to equip you as much as we can to start to think about your own identity as well as the identities of the students in your room. So if you think about when you enter a classroom space, and we talked about this yesterday, all these people, we bring in who we are, right? So we're going to spend some time today thinking about who are you and how do you enter your classroom and how does that contribute to student learning and how can we best set up thriving, not just as faculty, but as student learners as well. The other thing that I'll point out to you is that when you go through these kinds of sessions, I don't know if you're like me, but I find myself, whenever we're talking about diversity or difference or others focus, I find myself reacting at times. And sometimes I find myself getting a little defensive, and sometimes I find myself getting a little self-righteous. And so what I want to encourage you to do today is to model what you want your first-year students to do. When they encounter difficult or interesting, and this isn't going to be a difficult dialogue, but when they encounter something in a classroom that maybe is the first time they've heard it said that way, or it's something that they think, I don't know that I would say that way myself, or actually the way you said that kind of offended me. How would we want them to engage in that moment? So I'm asking you, if you find yourself in that moment, jot it down. And then when you return back to think about that moment, I don't want you to think about how you would justify your reaction. I want you to drill down and think, why did I react that way? What is it about my experience, my identity, my encounter in this particular rhetorical space that made me react the way that I did? Because that's really what we're going to try to help our students do, so that when we're in conversation, we drill down on why did you react that way? Let's think about that. Why did so-and-so react a different way? Gets back to that meta-communication, that metacognitive piece. So if we can model that today as learners in this space, I think that'll set us up well.
Thank you. So now you hand off your swivel guide to Richard.
You're going to come here because
and Richard, you need to come here.
Yeah, the swivel guide is another new FYS term.
So, to do four of us this way, it's very fun. All right. So this is our session plan. I don't know about you, but when I'm in a session, I like to know what's going to happen. So we're going to let you know, and we are going to, as Sarah very eloquently expressed, try to draw you in on maybe 3 different levels. We want to give you practical takeaways for your first-year seminar course and syllabus. So we've designed it to do that. We want to take you into conversation with yourself and others around social location and the students who will be in your classroom, and we have some activities to do that. We also had you read ahead of time, and Susie has wonderfully grouped you into your reading groups or your expert groups now, had articles that kind of pulls you into some of the diversity scholarship from a number of different disciplines. So that's our plan for today, and we would like to, we know that all of you will embody these rules in civil discourse with one another, but we never have a conversation like this with anyone, whether they're students or not, without talking about these, again, as a way to meta-communicate about what can happen when we get triggered, perhaps, and we're in the moment. And if we've talked about this ahead of time, then it's easier to step back. So these are just things to help us step back. Are there any things that we have forgotten here? I don't think I have confidentiality here, kind of what stays in the room, what we say in the room stays in the room. But are there things that you don't see from these ground rules that we need to think about when we're having this conversation? Because we'll add it. Well, and within what you're saying, I hear that there are things that are embedded in our culture around gender and other things that might make that happen. So thank you for that. And then speaking from your own experience, so if you're sharing in a group or you're sharing with a partner, please get permission from your partner, even if it was a fabulous thing that you know they would want to share. Please ask and just speak from your own experience. So, Richard.
Thank you. When you were sharing and adding to our norms, I thought, and I believe the reference was Ronald Heifetz in his book, The Leadership on the Line. And he didn't say it, but another author said it within that book, a holding place. A holding place is a safe space. And when I read that originally, I thought of just literally kind of like holding like a butterfly or a little caterpillar in your hand, is that is a safe space to reside. And so this is what you've modeled for us and for me over the last day and a half or more, is that this is a holding place in which we can talk, in which we can grow, in which we can meet new people, in which we can network. And so I find that invigorating. So thank you for being part of that journey with us in this safe space. In fact, within that safe space, I asked Starla if I could share the connection that she made just yesterday about making connections with our students through the pictures in the electronic gradebook, that there are pictures. And so you can start even learning your class through the pictures, so that when they walk through the door, then you go, oh, hi, Catherine, how you doing? Oh, wow, you know who I am. And that connection is so important. And the name makes a connection when you know someone's name. And it's a doorway into knowing. It's a doorway into who they are. It's a doorway into a conversation. So we're going to model that through what's in a name. And it's an activity that you can use also in your classes. So what's in a name? Well, Stephanie and I are going to model that for you. And in a moment, you're going to have an opportunity to pair up with someone. You don't have to be sitting next to them, but we would like for you to pair up with someone who you may not know well. And then you'll go through sharing your name. Once again, in a safe space, share what is safe for you to share, because our names are personal. So you can go as deep as you'd like, or be as safe and close to your heart as you'd like. So either way. So I'll model that for you.
But just before you start, yes. I'm going to say yesterday, Lori talked about the power of narrative and what that can mean. And there were concerns raised about the privacy pieces that Richard is talking about in terms of what we want to share or not having names. So this is a workshop, so we want you to think about, because this has been, it's been very powerful in my classroom and in some other settings. We want you to think about, how would students perceive an activity like this? How are you going to perceive an activity like this? So kind of that other level of what's going on as we go through this.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. So we're going to model this for you, and I'm going to stand over here so I can see the prompts.
I'm cheer for you.
Okay, pair up with someone and stay standing so you get to move around, especially at this time of the afternoon. It's important to move around a little bit. And I'm going to share a little bit about my name. So my complete name is Richard S. Martinez. The S is for Stephen, so that's important for me because my mother wanted to name me Steve, but my cousin Steve was born first. And so as a result, she liked Richard as well. So, but Stephen is my middle name. My preferred name, professionally, it depends on who I'm with. So Richard Martinez or Richard S. Martinez professionally. Richard is often, or Rich. If you go back to my family, And around my older aunts, uncles, family, sometimes I end up being a Richie, you know, so that kind of sneaks in. My mom gave me my name, and it's significant because I'm a Richard, not a Ricardo. And so I had asked her about, well, you know, what's the history of my name, and about some assumptions that go along with my name. And it really goes back to my family wanting to be successful in the mainstream society and in school. Experiencing my name. So how I experience my name, it's really interesting because it depends on who I'm interacting with. In fact, I'm going to go to the next one. How I think others experiencing my name is that sometimes there are assumptions that go along with being a Martinez. So from being very proud of my Latin culture, Latino culture, I carry that with me. However, some people who might assume that I speak Spanish, and I really don't. I don't speak Spanish well. In fact, when I've co-facilitated with Esther Atterbury, sometimes we'll stand up next to each other and say, which one of us speaks Spanish fluently? Oh, well, maybe Richard does. No. Esther's the one who speaks Spanish fluently. So sometimes our assumptions take hold, especially in regard to, say, a surname. And I asked my mom about, you know, the choice about speaking Spanish in the home or not. And she said, well, we wanted you to be successful in the home, or rather, well, in school, rather. In the home, no Spanish. We wanted you to be successful in the school system. And that really set the stage for me in my professional career, because I feel as if no student should have to check their culture or their language at the door in order to be part of a place called school. So
Thank you, Richard.
that's a little bit about
Very
my
interesting.
name. Now you're going to have a chance to share as well. So find a partner, stand up, an opportunity to stretch, and then each one of you give yourselves a couple minutes to share. So you're going to have a total of 6 minutes of this time, and I'll give you an opportunity to share it with each other.
Okay, so some of you did read Article A, which was by Adams and Love, and talked about a social justice framework in the classroom. And if you were to look at Adams' earlier work with Martinez in 1992, you would have seen a 4-quadrant framework, which the reflective exercise that you were asked to read through the questions on yesterday and was at your table are based on. And Sarah actually got permission from the authors a few years ago, and she created the reflective exercise that you see. What color is that sheet? Nope.
Okay.
Salmon. Some salmon sheets. So we have used that in a variety of settings. Some of you may have been to sessions we've been facilitating or using in your school to help us think through elements of classroom practice. So what do I think about in terms of my content? You know, what am I doing beyond a typical Eurocentric stream in my content? And if that is the stream in my discipline, am I bringing out questions in the classroom to ask why? Am I letting every voice speak into that and share what that's about in my discipline? And then teaching methods, and that is it's a pretty safe place, and it's where a lot of us are able to experiment with active learning and things that do draw on other voices. So we also have an engagement activity handout that gives you some ideas for some different ways to do that with your different students. But what we find, as Sarah indicated at the beginning of this session, that doesn't get covered, particularly Sarah, thank you for bringing out that piece on Curtis Collins, in an evangelical institution, and the literature shows this as well, is talking about our own social location, what we as faculty members bring to the classroom, what our students bring in terms of their own identity formation, and our hope is that we can continue to develop common language around having those conversations so that when dynamics arise in the classroom, which they inevitably do, whether I'm teaching chemistry, at least is that right, you teach chemistry, or whether I'm teaching a diversity class, the whole spectrum, there are dynamics, and the more that we are aware of our own triggers on our own social location in the classroom and how that plays out in the culture at large, the more effective we're going to be with our students, the more authentic space we're going to be able to develop, the more we're going to be able to say, I don't know, but let's have this conversation. So, I'm going to let you.
Yeah, so I was so grateful yesterday when Eileen and Lori, and then again today, I felt like Rebecca and Kieran hit on the fact that when we talk about first year seminar, what we do not want to do is bifurcate and say, oh, well, there's life of the mind and there's student life, right? Because those two things are not separate. It's not a dichotomous like either or. They're integrated. And this is how we feel about this, right? Is that diversity in the classroom is not just the contents, the books, and whether or not it talks about diversity. And what I would argue is that life of the mind is not just those things either. Life of the mind also has to do with what students bring into a classroom space and what faculty bring into a classroom space, and how our awareness of that and reflection around that fosters learning. It fosters student thriving. So I want to draw your attention, and we don't have time to do it, but I want to walk you through something that I use in a lot of classes that I teach, and they're not necessarily diversity classes. So it's the yellow page, and it's called the Identity Petals Exercise. And let me say, Stephanie is so gracious in attributing this. This happens in a lot of different ways around the country, but this was just the graphic that I designed and some of the prompts that I've used to help facilitate this kind of conversation in a classroom. What we would have done today, if we had more time, was we were going to ask you to do this exercise, Identity Petals. And basically, if you flip over to the, this is like a pseudo flower. Okay? If you flip over to this, and I don't know if there's a slide in here that takes you to, I got you. Oh, sorry. If you flip over to this, basically what this exercise leads people, faculty, students into is a conversation about what was mentioned. The idea that our identities, our various aspects of our identity overlap, they intersect. So I am not just a woman. I am not just white, I'm not just a mom or a daughter. All these different things, pieces of my identity are overlapping, intersecting. And part of how we develop critical thinking in our students, and part of how we develop their increased consciousness around diversity and the others and embracing hospitality and embracing the other, is helping them to understand overlapping, intersecting identities. And so that's exactly what this activity is trying to do. That there are not, identities are not just random interchangeable traits, but that the way that we situate ourselves, and we talk about this often, we term it the lexicon social location. So how you find yourself socially located in a classroom, in a discussion, in a relationship. The way we talk about this interprets how we make sense of the things we encounter, ideas, how we engage in a classroom or disengage, how we react to readings, how we are triggered or not triggered in certain environments. So here's how you do this activity. Or you could ask your students, or we would have had you do this. You write your name in the center of it, and then we set it up and we say to students, use the outer segments, right? So these little places that have nothing in them, to put in a word, a phrase, something that captures how you view this particular aspect of your identity. And inevitably, it happens with faculty, it happens just as much as it does with students. They'll say, well, what do you mean? Like, what's the right thing to say? And it's important to say, there's not a prescriptive way to do this. How do you identify according to that category? And sometimes they may say, I don't know that I do. Well, then put a question mark. That's important. It's important for you to know that. Because for some people, and we get to this in the debriefing part, because for some people, that thing that you put a question mark in is the most salient piece of their identity. It's the thing they think about constantly. And you didn't know what it meant. And that's okay. It's not a blame game or saying, oh, you're somehow, remedial because you haven't thought about that. It's a way to help people understand their social location, to understand how they make sense of various aspects of their identity. So you would go through each of these, and you'll notice down here at the bottom it says other identity important to me. Now sometimes people have 18 things they want to put there, and that's okay. So if you were leading this or if you were doing it yourself, the idea is that you help them engage it in a way that's meaningful for them, right? Now, are there any questions about that before I move on as you look at it? What questions do you have? Or maybe you say, how would I help explain that?
Oh, it seems like you would just, when I look at that, I feel immediately defensive for the gay students. That you're just, because they either have to lie or out themselves 2 weeks into their college career.
Wait, no, this is a personal activity. We haven't said anything about sharing it with anybody yet.
Yeah, but if they're smart, they're going to know that there's always that teacher that's going to be, now share it with your neighbor.
Right, so that's how you would set it up then, right? You set it up, and the way that I typically think about anything that has to do with identity or defense mechanisms, which is typically everything we teach, right? How do you set it up in such a way that you demystify the process And so I would be using things like ground rules. I would be saying things like, this is for your eyes only. This is to help you think about it. And guess what? It's not as important what you put on there as that you're reflecting on it, right? So what you choose to share is what you choose to share. I'm asking you to do this kind of like the writing thing. I'm more interested in the idea than what gets put on the paper and how it's developing and contributing to your learning, right?
Yeah, so I'm wondering, I like the way that you introduced it with the prompt. It seems like it'd be really easy to fill this out like a form.
Like a demographic?
Yeah, demographic. And so much of this really, if we're going to be honest, could be more fluid. And so maybe even just setting that up with an example or a way to sort of help students.
That's right.
You don't just have to dichotomize this.
That's right.
Or
exactly. And so usually that's what I'll do, is I'll say, so what might types of responses be under, let's say, gender? And they're like, male or female, and I'm like, anything else? Right? And then there's people go, oh. Right? And later in the debrief, I'll go back and say, now when I posed that anything else question, I saw people in the room change. What was that about? Why is that hard for us to talk about here? Right? And you can kind of get into some of those conversations. So I love what you said exactly. It's kind of like what Richard did with the name activity, is how do we model those things? How do we scaffold it really to get them to enter the conversation or to enter the activity in meaningful ways? So let me keep moving on so you can kind of see what happens. I also say to them, feel free to create additional petals, because this is not the sum of who we are, right? These are things that people often recount as salient pieces of their identity, but there are many that aren't represented on here. So you give people the autonomy to say, well, this is a key part of who I am that I didn't see represented, and to create petals around that. Okay, so we would work through it quickly, and then you begin to scaffold a reflective process, okay? First thing I ask people to do is I say, draw a square, and they'll say, like, well, where? Where do you want me to draw? This is for you. Draw a square next to the aspects of your identity that you think about on a daily basis. Okay? Everyone does that. You give them some time, and they'll have questions. What am I supposed to do? Draw a square next to the, repeat the prompt. Draw a circle next to the aspects of your identity that you believe affect how other people view or treat you. And then the flip of that, draw a triangle next to the aspects of your identity that you believe affects how you view or treat other people. Now, I actually don't think it's on here, but the other thing that we like to do is we ask people to use arrows, either an up arrow or a down arrow. And what I usually set it up as, and I take this from Peggy McIntosh, who's done a lot of work around privilege and identity, and not just racial privilege, but also all manners of identities. She talks about this social justice privilege line. Now sometimes, as we talked about a little bit earlier, sometimes that language irks people because they think it's political language. But what we mean when we say social justice privilege line, it's related to that question of social location. So if you think about this invisible line that's woven through society and our experience of life, Peggy McIntosh would say that anything above that invisible line that you would consider a part of who you are, and that you receive an advantage because of that, that would be something that's above the social justice privilege line. And it's important that I say that those are advantages that were unearned. It wasn't anything I did. It's just an advantage. I'm in an advantaged position because of kind of the reality of society. Anything below that would represent those things that I somehow experience disadvantage. Now, this is a great and important place to point out that that is fluid, right? That it depends on your social location. It depends on the point in life. It may depend on the class. It may depend on the context. It may depend on the year. It may depend on the day, right? And that we have to set up this process where we allow students to complexify that. That it doesn't always fit in neat little boxes. But based on this activity, we would ask students to say, draw either an up arrow or a down arrow with that idea of the social justice privilege line on the aspects of your identity where you think they fall above the social justice privilege line or they fall below. Okay? Now, what you'll see is that that's not as easy for people. It's not easy for us. You probably start to think about what would I do in my own little identity petals that I'm doing. The point of this activity is not to put people in boxes. The point of the activity is to get to the prompts. Okay? And so what we would have asked you to do if we had time today was to complete this activity and then to begin to talk about some of these larger debriefs. First, we would have said, without needing to share your identity petals exercise, turn to someone or to a small group and talk about your experience of this. And what starts to happen is people talk about, well, it was hard for me, or it was vulnerable for me. There's some aspects of my identity that I'm not happy or willing to disclose because I don't really know any of you, right? That's an important conversation to be had in the classroom. Other people will say things like, well, I don't like that this is meant to make me feel guilty. No, that's not actually what it's meant. So then the question becomes, as an instructor, let's talk about why we react to the activity the way that we do. And so I was talking to Stephanie the other day, because we've done this a million times, right? We've facilitated it, we've done it in workshops, and I still find myself, every time I do this, I want to find something that I feel disadvantaged in. Because it's an easier place to be than it is to own privilege. It's easier for me to want to say, like, well, this is how I've been oppressed. These are all the ways that I've been. And so particularly as a person of privilege in the academy, it's easier for me to rescind privilege and just say, no, as a woman, here are the ways I have experienced hardship. Well, I like to have conversations about that in class. So what is it that makes me want to go to that place rather than to talk about my privilege, rather than to talk about the things that are invisible, that I don't have to encounter every day, right? That's where some of the really rich reflection comes at. Again, it's not about right or wrong, what boxes are you in. It's about some of that meta-communicating. What are the dynamics that impact the way we enter these kinds of conversations? So other questions we put up here, what patterns do you notice when you look at where your shapes are placed? How does it feel to have a list of all the aboves or the belows in front of you? Or how does it feel to have all of these things that you feel like people are always thinking about you or judging you through these lenses, or the things that you think you may be looking at or judging other people based on? So you may say, oh great, that's great for a diversity class. I do it in other classes, and I do it early in the semester, and then I unpack why I did it. And I say, because as we move throughout the semester or the term, it's important for me that we always have this in mind. Because when I then hear somebody who perhaps rated this differently or had different shapes, different ups and downs, when I hear them say something, as an instructor, I'm going to harken back to sometimes and say, now, before we enter into this conversation, I want you to think about when somebody comes at something from a different perspective, could it be that their shapes were different than yours? Could it be that their arrows were in different directions? And why is it important for you to hear it in that context instead of just assuming that they're right or wrong about whatever the topic that we're discussing? In other words, how is social location always present? It doesn't matter what the topic is. It doesn't matter if it's a diversity topic or not. And it sets up a different kind of conversation in the classroom that I'm then constantly going back. And then I can say when we're talking about a theory, now, do you think there are any groups in the academy that might take issue with this theory? Do you think there's anyone who would say, this doesn't represent my perspective, this doesn't represent the way that I make sense of me, this particular topic, this isn't the way my culture, my family, my community would embrace this? It opens up diversity conversations no matter what the topic is. And that's part of what we're trying to do, is to get students to think more broadly, to think affectively, not just cognitively, right? And not just how we apply a certain thing, but affectively. How does it begin to change the way you see the world, you see your role in the world, and the way you see your duty and response to engage? That's all I'm going to say on that. Okay, we've given you some handouts, some resources also on the iTunes University that would address the different areas of the quadrants that we talked about, things for you to think about in terms of what you bring as a faculty member, what your students bring. Again, discussion activities that include all voices facilitated well, and then the reflective exercise for you just to think about in terms of your syllabus. Ask yourself some questions, maybe challenge yourself to look at an area that you haven't in the past.
So, in a relatively brief time, we've explored many different dimensions of inclusive pedagogy, had our conversations around articles, we've had our names explored, we've had at least an introduction to how a pedal activity might be used, and also earlier I was talking to Sarah that as educators, we have this mind of modification too. So you may already be thinking of other applications or ways of tweaking some of these activities that would fit the needs of your classes. So you notice that Susie is passing out some Cracker Jacks, and this is just a little popcorn discussion. We're going to go to Costco and get popcorn and treat you to some popcorn. So this is a popcorn / Cracker Jack activity. We're only going to take about 5 minutes. But in popcorn style, what are some thoughts you're thinking about right now? What about the activities we've just been doing over the past hour and a half? It could be applications, it could be some things you're just sitting with. You might still have some questions you just want to throw out. What are some thoughts in popcorn style, and anyone can just join in? Here.
So I've been thinking about, I heard that in some of our research on the issue of diversity at the university, that some of our students have complained, rightly so, that they have been singled out in classes to as some sort of a representative of a minority position, right? And I don't know exactly how that all come about. That's about the soundbite that I've gotten. So could you talk about what that is, if you know about this, how this has come up here, and how we can prevent that, or a better practice than however it's being done currently, okay, regarding asking certain students to give to, I don't even know how it's being presented in the classroom in such a way that the students don't appreciate it. But how, can you talk about that situation?
I'll address how the Activate came in, and then our team may want to just chime in. A group of students, Activate, said, you know what, sometimes we feel as students of color that we're put on the spot in the classroom. It's like turning to Richard and saying, hey Richard, you know, give us the Latino perspective. And it's like, oh, well, I mean, am I the person that can talk for every Latino? And is my perspective like why I would feel put on the spot? Is that I know that my experience may not reflect everyone's experience, and to have that be in a public setting or in a classroom setting, there's a lot of dynamics that go on that is very uncomfortable, and there's a power differential, and privilege is part of that as well. So the Activate students were calling us out, that sometimes that happens on campus, in classroom, and out of the classroom. Any other thoughts then?
Well, I think you might be referring to the data too. So, so the Harry data, you know how we do the faculty Harry survey? Well, there's also a student survey. And those results over the last, I think 2 or 3 results have been going in a downward trajectory in terms of how students experience sense of community, sense of belonging. Trying to think of the other climate. What was that? Campus climate. So those are self-reports, and so sometimes people say, oh, well, that's because they've got a chip on their shoulder. Well, wait a minute. Like, we need to look at that institutionally and say what's happening. So Richard's talking about a student movement. It was a group of undergrad students, and it was mainly the leadership of the movement. They called themselves Activate, and they're still on campus. I was getting emails this week even. It's mainly the student leaders of the ethnic organizations on campus who said, this has been a problem for years, and we need to organize around it. We need to kind of bring in the conversation to the administration, to faculty. And so, rightly so, they brought that forward. And I think what you're asking is, so how do we make sure that doesn't happen? Well, the tokenizing issue in the classroom is an ongoing problem. And I think what happens is, it sends a message to students when we do what Richard talked about, when we say to a student, on behalf of all Latinos, on behalf of all gay students, you're an outwardly gay student, what's your experience like at APU, right? When we do that, when we tokenize them, then we make them responsible for everybody else's learning. And so my quick answer that requires a lot more unpacking and depth and thought around it is, how do you cultivate spaces where you're helping people own the work? And the best way to do that is to model it yourself. So in other words, to be able to come into a conversation, and if I think, oh, this would be really important for a Latino perspective, then I give that perspective through an activity, through an article, through a clip, or something else that fosters that. So then you have students saying, being able to relate or being able to engage it differently than putting the burden of the educating on the person who's maybe not of critical mass, right? There's not a critical mass in the classroom with that population. Does that get at it a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm wondering, so is this just a failed, not very thoughtful attempt to give voice to voices that have not been, I mean, is it?
So there's different authors who write about this, and one of the, is it Martinez? Somebody writes about, they call it malefic generosity. It's not a great term. So this idea that in an effort to be generous and hospitable, we do some things that have really bad results. And that's one of the things, it's kind of like, oh, I'm just going to add difference and stir it up and it'll be great and everybody will feel included. Well, it's a little more complicated to that. And I say that not to scare us, but to kind of take responsibility and to say, if you really want to cultivate a classroom space where there is more than one voice, then it's your responsibility as the faculty and to help students engage it so that they don't just depend on someone else. We could look at this, I mean, so my research would say, how do institutions do this administratively too? So we say, oh, well, we've got a Richard, he'll do the diversity stuff, right? So I mean, there's all different ways this plays out. Well, at the student level, I think it often plays out where we tokenize underrepresented students, whatever those various demographic groups are, we tend to tokenize them, put the burden on them to educate everybody else.
And I'm totally agreeing with Sarah, and I think for the seminars, I think this is a really important point because this will be a more interactive kind of class where we want to get as many student voices in the classroom and as comfortable as possible. So I think things just like normalizing people being called on, I mean, depending on your seminar can be really helpful because a lot of students are going to be quiet for different reasons. And I think sometimes, you know, often with the best of intentions, it just feels like, oh, I haven't heard from that person. But then it does often come across as, oh, but now I'm going to be asking them to speak for possibly a group where that's how it's heard. So I think it's really just important just to know that some students are going to be really introverted. Some students are going to be like, I know I'm the only one of that group. So if they're asking me for that group. So just to kind of, and use that whole meta-communication thing that Sarah speaks to so well about, wow, what I'm really noticing is a few people are talking more. And I think a lot like the petals exercises and things like that are great at enhancing student awareness of their own privilege. But sometimes when they get like, oh, we're privileged, so kind of like we have to make things better, then they end up having more airtime with their own story. So I mean, there are just so many complex nuances. Marjorie. Yeah.
Well, one of the things we talked about in our group that I thought was fantastic was Jessie brought up a point about how in a film class, I think, was that? Yeah, about just the sort of the stories and how he had begun to realize that some of the great stories, and I thought about it as that canon of like great books, whose stories are they and what stories aren't being included, and just even at a very thoughtful content level to be more creative and inclusive and thinking about if there isn't availability right, of better stories, why is that? Whose stories aren't being told? Why aren't they making them into that canon of great books or great films or whatever?
But yeah, one great resource which you may be familiar with is Ronald Takaki's book, A Different Mirror. And Takaki talks about how, it's back to what Wendy mentioned and her group mentioned earlier about a different narrative. In Takaki's book, he talks about history as the frame. But what is learned commonly really isn't the full story. And so stories and personal narratives are powerful as well to add in the different dimensions that Gary's bringing up, because within my background and my cultural background and within my identity, it's multifaceted. Everybody has that multifaceted quality as well. And there's some key questions that we can ask. And so Susie,
so you have a handout, I'll just spend 1 minute on it. It's stapled white pages here. And it's just
just something to think of as you're having these discussions and talking about people's stories and narratives and what they believe in as you're presenting your content. Take a look at these cultural themes that often reflect the dominant values that we may be, you know, coming across and not realizing. So in terms of achievement and success, you emphasize that people, you know, can come from rags to riches, you know. Or is there another story that maybe many of your students have in their experiences? So just take a minute to flip through those, and it's a nice way to see both sides, or another way of viewing it.
The only other thing I'd say, and Steph mentioned this, but kind of got glossed over, the blue packet, that's engagement techniques. So a lot of these, not all of them, but a lot of them come out of Stephen Brookfield's work. He's probably one of my favorite authors because he is so cognizant of creating inclusive classroom spaces. And so these kind of get back to what you were saying, Gary. Like, so how do you do that? How do you get perspectives out without tokenizing or calling on people? He is the master of coming up with ideas and activities. And so that's just a snapshot of some of his activities that we feel like we've used a lot in our various classroom situations. He has many books, and I believe there's a full list of references that Stephanie put together within iTunes U. So Brookfield is a great resource if you want to buy a book or 5. He just has great activities, and that is just a snapshot of some of the ones that we think are really helpful at doing exactly what Gary was asking.
He's also a great sharer of resources, and if you just go to his website, www.stephenbrookfield.com, he shares his slides, he shares recent research. He's got a 30-year repository, and he's a very open educator, and will do that.
So drawing our popcorn discussion to a close, unless there's another thought.